Well, we have our one captive audience, and that's good enough for me.
Looks like we've had one other jump in.
Yeah, yeah. So you might be wondering why we brought you all here today. We had a gamification series workshop that we did with Gina Petrie over the last month and a half or so, and we're continuing that into a further series. So we learned how it was done in one class, and what we're attempting to do in this series is how to do it yourself. Like, what even is gamification? So the whole point here is to familiarize everyone with the concepts behind it, what it even means, and the philosophy behind gamification. And we understand this huge, big, overwhelming concept, and it gets thrown around a lot, but nobody really knows what it means. Like, people are told, well, we need to gamify this. Okay, well, how do you even do that? So that's the point of this. We want to give people some ideas, some guidelines, some tools that they can use in order to bridge that gap that is currently in place. So let's see, how do I do this? Going this way. All right. So this is just a basic table of contents of things we're going to cover, more or less an introduction of myself and my friend Nigel here. We're going to cover the old ways of doing things, how narrative storytelling is kind of the bedrock behind what we're trying to do, and then go into the details of what it actually means when people say gamification. And then we'll have some questions and answers throughout the presentation. If more people show up, then we might even have a little point allocation based on who's asking or answering questions. Ooh, so get excited about that. And then the crew. So who are these guys? Well,
Shall we begin?
yeah, well, I'll just start really quick. If you don't know me already, I'm the instructional designer here at the Faculty Commons Department.
At the Faculty Commons.
Yeah.
That's the noun.
The Faculty Commons. Yeah, that's a L word. I've got about 15 years experience in how not to create educational content, but actually witnessing it, thinking about how I can improve it and making it better. And then that's kind of what led me to be a instructional designer here at Eastern Washington University. But I want to toss it over to my good friend Nigel. Nigel, would you please?
Hi, I'm Nigel Pingree. I am a writer and an editor, and more recently, a game designer. And I have quite an interesting history with education, just as a concept overall, going from being homeschooled when I was young to moving into public school through a little bit of middle school and high school, and then going through college and then graduating and interacting with all this stuff. Most recently, briefly working in an elementary school, like after school program, and just sort of seeing the contrast between the ways that educational methods impact learners and stuff like that. And also being very interested in games ever since I was a kid, really. And I've been quite fascinated with the attention that people are capable of putting to the things that they find fun. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about here today, is the potential for attention in games.
Captures it fairly well. So let's see. Introduction. So should we start off with a little bit about how we met?
Yeah, sure. So I think it was April of 2021. So we met over this sort of community-driven narrative that we were both part of, a community that was voting on a branching storyline that we were very invested in. And I used to, actually, I still do sort of, but it's not really all that relevant anymore. But I used to run a sort of a weekly breakdown of those story beats. And I think it was April of 2021 when I introduced trivia as a way to try to get people to participate a little bit more so that they would show up, so we'd have more people to talk and all that sort of thing. So I introduced trivia, and it was interesting how effective that was at getting people to sort of get invested in what was going on in a story that they were maybe starting to have some waning interest in. And it was particularly I was notable of my co-hosts for designing extremely difficult trivia. And I'll circle back to why that's important a little later.
Yeah. So, and I was introduced obviously to this. I joined shortly after this project had started, and Nigel here was one of the hosts of this weekly show, and so he'd have this weekly run through of the storyline that was very much community driven. So they'd have this story that was written, and at the end of the story, the authors would give the community a chance to vote on what the outcome would be. And so then based on whatever percentage of people clicked left or clicked right, that would drive the narrative for the following week. And so it was really fun because we'd be able not only to participate in what direction the story went, but then it was interesting for us because Nigel would have these weekly shows with this trivia, and it would make us go back through and search through previous weeks of the story to try and find the answers that he was goading us, sometimes quite evilly, to try and find. And a lot of times we would try the tried and true Control F method of just searching for keywords, but because of his ability to make these questions difficult and more esoteric, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I would work fairly hard to reword things so that you couldn't search for them directly, contrary to my co-hosts who used to make it easy on purpose.
Right, exactly. But, kind of a foil for AI, really. You want to talk about that part, but I mean, it was really really interesting and fun for us. It made us want to compete with each other because it'd be 4 points, and points would result in some kind of reward within the greater game universe.
Right. And so sometime later, I ended up adding another form of trivia. Anybody here who's ever heard of Car Talk? I don't know how popular that is where you guys are, but anyone who's heard of that will recognize this. I added a section called Stump the Chumps, which was basically just reverse trivia. So I had for months then been coming up with questions about the story and asking people for extremely specific information about it, and eventually came up with the idea, well, I'll just have them comb through the story and come up with questions and see if I can come up with the answers off the top of my head. And I was quite good at this. And that played into this sort of extra, like this sort of meta narrative that we had created around this story, where I had gained this reputation for making these extremely hard questions, and now was challenging my audience to give me the hardest questions and the most hyper specific questions they could come up with. And this just intensified the engagement that much more. So the people who were interested in this got that much more invested in it. And that was a lot of fun. It also just helped me to realize that like some games are just better than others. Like trivia is a very basic concept, right? I mean, trivia is essentially what we play when we give someone a test. But when you turn that on its head, suddenly the same very simple model just turned around backwards. It's completely different and a lot more fun. I mean, if you gave your students a blank sheet of paper and said, come up with questions that you think that I won't know the answer to, they're going to have to understand the concepts well enough to try to best you. And suddenly they're trying way harder without even realizing that they're working. So it was such an inspiring moment. I was very, very proud of that little creation, even though it wasn't even my idea to begin with.
Now we had to modify some of the rules because there were a few like extremely ridiculous questions, like how many times did somebody do X? So obviously that gets a little bit of
many instances of the letter E are there and everything. Yeah, but beyond the completely ridiculous, it was very successful. I think.
Yeah. So this guy's really talking a lot about, okay, we love this amount of interaction that we're having between us. And he was more or less playing the role of the instructor, and the rest of us were students, but it was more like a game show host kind of a situation. So it really inspired us with this deep understanding of how games like this can not only enhance the learning of content, but also just shoot engagement of the audience through the roof. We weren't really thinking about how it would integrate into the education into education at the time. But after I started focusing on instructional design in my career, we both began kind of looking for ways to integrate the lessons we learned from that process into how our courses could be revised and be re-envisioned as more of a game playthrough type process. So hopefully that kind of gives it a little bit about how we ended up here, but also illustrate a broader point about narrative. So we just told you a story, and through that story, we reinforced the significance and the legitimacy of our point. We could have just told you that games motivate people to learn, but this way we think is far more effective because people learn through telling of stories and demonstrating of the concepts, really.
Right. So essentially to drive the point of anecdote home, right? There's a lot of, I think a lot of scientists particularly will, maybe rightly so, malign anecdotal evidence, but there's something that you have to remember, which is the reason why anecdotal evidence in science particularly is kind of dangerous, is because it's so much more compelling. So the best place for anecdote is in education. So when you have a story that makes a point, use a story if you want to convince people of things, if you want to motivate people of things. Story is how human beings communicate and how they engage and become attached to things. So just giving people raw data seems compelling and seems efficient, but that just isn't how people work. So we want to kind of get into the major point of why gamification is important at all, really. So shall we move along to that?
Yeah, I'll just make the connection to the podcast we actually had last week, Cindy, because you were making a comment about a study that involved people's feelings about certain rules and or policies, whereas it didn't really matter if the rules or policies were effective or not. They felt better because they knew that the rules existed. And that, I think that is kind of in a similar way to this. To the next. Let's move to the next one there. Yeah. So why do this? Why gamification at all?
So if you think about the way that school has been Like it was a very inefficient, bad education for people who did not care and did not try. But for those of us who are willing to ask questions, it was probably one of the best educations that you could get. You just had to bring your own education in a way, which sounds like we did all the work, but that's not quite how it happened. And so in a similar way, I remember when I was doing like after school and summer camp stuff with little kids, I remember saying to them, some of these games, you really have to bring your own fun. You have a group of kids play the same game, and half of them just hate it. They don't know what it is. They just hate it. And the other half of the classroom is just having the time of their lives because they've decided that it's going to be fun because they're just in that kind of mood today. They could turn anything into the time of their lives. And so the only way that you can really control whether or not a student is going to latch on to something like this is if you are offering them a perspective, a sort of a sample perspective, kind of like what you were saying about just decide for us. That's essentially the energy here, is that you're just going to decide for them that they're having fun because you're having fun and there's no room for no one having fun here. This is also reflective of our particular student population. Students at EWU often come from a background of educational experiences that don't foster questioning authority, including faculty. You're geared to be complicit and thus more familiar with being told exactly what to do. This comment is delayed and it's delayed. Okay.
Who made the comment?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, it's Jesse Willis. I joined late, so just disregard. I was just kind of trying to participate.
Not to worry. Thank you for the comment, because it does make a lot of sense, and it is good to know because, like,
Sorry, I'm looking between the script. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I'm listening in. I was just like the response of students to being told what to do, I think, is something that we have to address as faculty for our particular student population. And so, like, how do you get them to buy into? And I think that's what Nigel's talking about. So
yeah.
Carry on.
Well, it's really good that you mention that, because that's not necessarily something that I was aware of, and it's something that Jim and I should probably know, because
if one, they've hurt students to have some agency. We want
in terms of supporting the staff, right, or rather the faculty, I suppose. But in terms of supporting the faculty with trying to gamify a course, it is important for us to know that they're maybe not inclined to question things and to jump in and to challenge authority.
Jesse, did you have something? Another question or statement?
No, I mean, I'm really excited about trying to think about creative ways of engaging students that are complemented by part of what we need to do oftentimes, or I need to do when my experience with our students is getting them to be more active learners, and even talking about their agency and their voice and like being part of the learning experience. And certainly I tell them something similar to, I think, what Nigel was saying, which is you'll get out of your education here what you put into it, right? And so it will require your active participation. But there's, I think, a lot of fear, and a lot of times our students are geared towards being certain kinds of employees and going into certain areas of work, and they have not been given the same kinds of opportunities when I was working at private liberal arts schools, that those students already are sort of, they had been nurtured around asking questions and being curious. And I find that students will hold even questions that are entirely pertinent. They'll wait until after class, right? Or they'll ask each other rather than talk to me. And then I'll say, hey, somebody asked this, like, bring it into the conversation.
So this is a really good thing for me to think about, at least, because I have never been that kind of person. I have been an incessant and almost irritating question asker for my entire life. But it served me really, really well in school, to where I would arguably take over classes a little bit, and that might not have been great for getting through the curriculum on time. But what it did do is it allowed some of my favorite experiences were, for example, in high school, I had a professor who would just sort of dryly lecture, and you could tell that he was kind of drowning a little bit not because he didn't know what to do, but because he just hated what he was doing. And I remember when I started taking that class and I started asking questions, and I watched the light come alive from the student chair. I watched the light come alive in my teacher's eyes as he realized that he had the ability to like engage and spar and answer hypotheticals and make these connections where no one was giving him any, he wasn't getting any energy from the audience before. And similarly, when I was in college, my later phase of college, I had a professor who was teaching grammar, and it's interesting to think of grammar as a college class, but so it was. And most of the students in that class were failing. It worked for me. I loved that class. It was still to this day is my favorite class. And I would just go off on hypotheticals and we would just get into grammar theory for maybe a quarter of the class would just be us talking about different ways that words would interact and sentence structures and how they would interact. And while some of the students who were really, really behind and just didn't get it, that probably did them a disservice. The students who were keeping up probably got a lot out of that. So if you can get the majority of the students to make it over the midline, then if you just have a couple who are willing to engage and really sink their teeth in, they'll all come along for the ride. But it is really worth thinking about as we try and design these interactivities, like how can we make it as painless as possible? Because we really stumbled into sort of a stroke of genius with Summer Bridge, where we sat down to design a card game to try to get people who were shy to put themselves out there. And we actually had some really amazing success with that. We designed a social card game. And also we had people slingshot water balloons at gym. And who could say no to that?
No, nobody could. Everybody was.
And that's really the sort of thing is that, like, when it's possible, the ideal scenario is that you can create activities where people forget that they're being watched, right? They forget that they're being judged. And maybe even if they don't forget, they don't care because they're just having a good time. They're just messing around and experimenting.
That's the whole point of the narrative behind the entire course, isn't that everybody here tells stories in their courses, then they're through case studies, through personal life examples or whatnot.
Right.
But nothing is congruent. There's no consistency throughout it, and it doesn't link together, and the students aren't necessarily connected to that content. And so that's kind of what we're getting into here, is that if the students get to be part of that narrative, they get to be that hero. They get to be the main character. They get to have some agency in the decisions that get made during the course of that story and during the course of the course that actually has a beneficial outcome at the end that they helped create through their decisions.
If I'm not careful, I will go off onto a half an hour long tangent. But what I will say is that in the second presentation in a week, I'll have a section where I will want to talk about a video game franchise that maybe has cornered the market on selling failure, which, talking about students who struggle with decisiveness and interaction, what that sounds a lot like to me is people who will, as soon as they hit a wall, will say, "Oh, there's a wall there. I can't go. There's a wall there. I can't go forward anymore. I guess I just have to turn around and or sit here." Right. And there's a video game franchise that has done an exceptional job at teaching people how to smash through brick walls with their foreheads. I think that that's a very worthwhile discussion, maybe more so than I had realized before. So I'll maybe build that section out a little bit for next time. But yeah, definitely come back for that bit. A lot of what I will talk about is contextualized in video games because I'm obviously a giant nerd. And I wasted a lot of time playing a lot of video games, but I have been paying attention while I've been doing that. So, very good of you to change the slide and move me along before I go off for hours and hours. So what do we got here? All right.
I think it's the if you can't meet them, join them.
Right. Yeah. So I think I had mentioned earlier, if universities as a concept could just sort of obliterate all social media and all distraction, I think that educational retention would probably be a lot higher. People would be a lot more successful, and the world would very likely be a better place if we could just sort of preserve the institution of discipline and willpower. And wouldn't that be lovely? But I think that the door of TikTok can't really be closed. I think that now that people have figured out that those modes of entertainment exist, they're here to stay, for better or worse, maybe mostly worse. So what we're left with is kind of the need to play that game. Forgive the pun. And so how we do that is by kind of kidnapping the playbook, I think, from video games, not from social media, because I think short form education, while it is a thing on social media, is you can't get enough information into that. What you get from short form social media, which is the primary form of doom scroll and attention holding from social media these days, what you get from that is you get variety, which is very good for the distractibility of either natural or artificial ADHD. What you get from video games is another feature of ADHD, and also a feature that you get with some autistic people, which is hyperfocus. And hyperfocus is an incredibly powerful tool that anybody can do. Some people will find easier for various reasons. I mean, I would say that hyperfocus is the reason why traditional education was possible for me, because socially and temperamentally, it wasn't really my favorite thing. But I particularly, compared to my peers, was perfectly content to just sit there and not take any notes and listen to my lecturer drone on about whatever it was, because I didn't care about the presentation quality. I cared about the material, and I was able to retain that and then test on it. And that worked for me. It did not work for most of the people around me. And I think that that's bad. So what we want to do is we want to make it so that you are not working. We want to make it so that you are doing what I did when I would go home after school, and I would get on my computer and I would boot up my favorite video game. And then I would discover that that video game, well, it's not working right now. It's patching for 3 hours because my internet is bad or whatever it is. And so I would, instead of playing the video game, I would still have that itch. I would still be interested in it. And so what I would do instead is I would open up the Wikipedia for that video game and I would read walls and walls of information about that video game and about how I could do things differently in that video game. 3 hours of reading Wikipedia pages to support a video game addiction is pretty compelling in terms of a result that you can get from something just being intriguing. I remember a game called Hearthstone, and Hearthstone, it's not a TCG, it's a CCG, collectible card game. So it's a digitized card game, kind of like Magic the Gathering, some of you may be familiar with, but a heck of a lot simpler, based on World of Warcraft, which is one of the biggest video game IPs of all time. Hilariously, not one that I'm very familiar with. But Hearthstone had probably, I want to say several hundred, probably upwards of 500 individual cards. And I, for a very long time, knew every single one of them, their attack and defense stats, the text on each one of them, what they did, how they were used, what decks they were meta in or most effective in, just because it was a game that I thought was fun. And so all of that information just lived in my head. And I just acquired all of that information through playing the game. I didn't study it from a catalog or anything. It just sort of showed up there eventually, just from having a good time. And so we just want to try to use the same kind of technique as these video game companies have accidentally developed, right? They have created something that's fun, that you have a good time with, you get a lot of dopamine out of, presumably so that you will spend money on them. But what they've also inadvertently created is something where people, just as a byproduct of having a good time and presumably spending money on their product, have developed the ability to retain ungodly amounts of information about these games that they love, right? So we just kind of want to do the same thing. We want to create fun. Narrative is easy, not strictly necessary, but often narrative environments where there is a game or something to care about, something to be attached to for the students that is concerned directly with the class's subject, so that the student will be compelled to learn more about the subject so as to engage with the game or the story that they're passionate about, in much the same way that I had people in an audience that I was talking to who were narratively compelled to make me suffer a defeat. And so they would do a whole bunch of background research that was arguably torture for them on any other occasion, because they were going to get a kick out of maybe watching me go, I don't know, and then squirm a bit when I had to say that. And that was worth it for them. They would do work for that.
Yeah. It took an effort sometimes, and that's the amazing thing, is that we're not necessarily throwing out all the traditional learning techniques and saying it's all bad. It's all still very valuable, but the way in which it can be distributed to the students, the way they can experience it, can be done in a way that gets them this level of I want to say addiction, really. The same kind of addiction they would have towards playing their favorite game, they should have taking your class, and it should be just as fun for you to guide them through this experience as it is for them to be experiencing it.
Right. And another thing that's just worth bearing in mind is just sort of the ease of retention altogether, which is that some of you may be familiar with the idea that stress and trauma tend to induce fairly vivid memories. And so the idea that, you just need to stress people out, you give them test anxiety, things like that, they'll retain information. If you traumatize someone, things will be burned into their mind. And that is true. But what's actually more effective is play. Pretty much every mammal, when they're very young, play as a way to learn adult behaviors and things that they will need to be successful as adults. So young dogs will like play fight, and young cats will play hunt and things like that, right? And so humans are not different. And so all we need to do is to, for one thing, make it okay to play, because that's a bit of an issue with culture, which is that people have come to understand that playing is not productive. And if you are playing, then you are not accomplishing anything, and you should probably feel guilty. Maybe get rid of that. If you can try to downplay the guilt thing, which is pretty heavy for some people, and you can sort of try to evaluate them on the progression throughout their sort of engagement with play here. One of the things that we really strongly want to stress is making people comfortable with failure. This was something that I particularly struggled with, and probably still do in school, which is getting some sort of a negative experience is just like the end of the world. And you run into that wall, and if you actually hit the wall and you can't clear it somehow, you just give up, and you don't ever revisit that. But we want to find ways to make it so that when people hit walls, it's actually expected. And that, again, that's that whole thing that we're going to talk about in the next one. But essentially to say that we've got some plans for helping people get comfortable with failure to the point where they actually kind of enjoy it. And it's expected, and it becomes a sort of a necessitated piece of the learning experience, which is, I think, really important.
Yeah, so we can probably leave them hanging on that one. But before we do, does anybody have any questions or ideas of their own that they'd like to bring up? Is how long are you supposed to wait? 10 seconds, 20 seconds before somebody answers? I mean, right now, Teresa's leading in points. She'll pick that one. Okay, well, if nobody has any other questions, we'll hang it up for today. But I just really wanted to say thank you very much, Nigel. You've been key in helping me flush this out and coming up with some of the most creative ideas for this process. And I'm really excited for next week's presentation.
Yeah, be sure to show up for that one. Next week, we're going to get into a lot more specifics. I know that this was sort of a general overview of like, why are we here? What is this? And what are we doing? next week we'll talk about a lot more technical and actionable stuff for those of you who are interested in implementing some things. And then I think week 3, we're actually going to run an example workshop and actually build an example course. So that should
maybe an example module. Let's not get it.
or yeah, an example module. Thank you. That's fair.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we could probably fish there. And then I will obviously have a version of this up on the Faculty Commons website. So if anybody that wanted to see it or see previous workshops that we've done, they can always go to the Faculty Commons website, and the recorded version of this will be up there. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for showing up. It's been an absolute pleasure again. And thank you, Nigel. And we'll hopefully see you all next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.